Thank you very much, and Marcelo has already raised his hand.
Thank you so much, Professor Matlary, for that wonderful presentation. I listened to the papers on Spain, the papers on the United Kingdom, your paper, and I am thinking, we are at the precipice. It is time to take a step forward. That's what the political class is suggesting. Many things. First, on immigration, let's be very clear. The data are overwhelming. You look at connectivity with the labor market, you look at linguistic integration, you look at out-marriage patterns. The National Research Council, a non-partisan instrument of the United States Congress, just released the study to end those studies, and it was very, very clear. There's a net contribution to the economy that is quite substantial. Immigrants today are learning the language faster, better than the Italians learned English in Red Hook, in the Lower East Side of New York, in Brooklyn, 100 years ago. They have a much greater connectivity with the labor market. They're working, they're contributing, and they have a very interestingly, very high rates of outmarriage, meaning the exogamic principle is at the center of the American story in immigration. So this is my understanding. I was a child, a young professor in Paris, and I learned from our French scholars that there may be differences between the European model and the American model, and this may live in the context of the welfare state in terms of the connectivity of the immigrants with the structures and the institutions of the new society. Second, let's be very clear about this. Terror. And I'm happy that you brought up this issue, terrorism. Terrorism is an issue, increasingly, of the dystopic integration of the second generation. The data on this are very powerful. In France, but also certainly in the United States. It is the second generation. It is the deracinated second generation. There's a beautiful chapter in William James's The Varieties of the Religious Life when he talks about the born-again experience. These are the criminals. These are completely deracinated, de-religious people that they end up in penitentiaries. There's a wonderful film called Malcolm X, the story of Malcolm X. And this is a study of the varieties of the religious experience, William James's fundamental text. It is the children of the second generation that are deracinated and lead lives of petty crime and become indoctrinated in the internet. It's all very clearly studied now. It is not a problem generally, certainly in the United States, of the first generation. Furthermore, the data in I'm talking about the United States because I'd like you to reflect upon the differences, if I may just finish. Now, the data from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the data from the criminal justice system are very, very clear on this, that the lack of structures and strictures in the transition of the immigrant origin children is what is at stake here. And this is a failure of education. Europe went into mass migration with the eyes wide shut, no thinking. I was very honored to be invited to give a presentation at the German Foreign Office. 150 years of American immigration prove one thing: it will change the country. And you cannot go into immigration without a clear understanding. The die is cast. Yeah. The die is cast. It's a second generation issue. You can seal the borders tomorrow. You still have a problem in Europe.
Yeah, let me just, I'm not an expert on this field, of course, but it's interesting that the multicultural ideology becomes such a big problem, because one isn't saying you must adapt to this social contract. We demand this and that of you, and then you get a job and you make a career. I remember the Somalis in Norway, or hardly anybody has a job. The Somalis in the US, they are really working hard. So I mean, there's a tremendous difference, and we don't speak about assimilation is a very negative term then, but Fukuyama uses assimilation as the sort of normal term in his book, and I was jumping when I saw it, because assimilation, isn't that too much? But he says European states should impose stringent requirements on the naturalization of new citizens, something the US has done for many years. In the US, new citizens are expected to be able to read, write, and speak basic English, have an understanding of US history and government, have no criminal record, and demonstrate an attachment to the principle and ideals in the US Constitution, etc. And European states should do the same. This hasn't happened in Europe. In addition, in the US, you have to find a job. In Europe, you cannot work while you apply for asylum. So it takes years before you're able to allow to seek employment. So this is clearly I mean, this is where the problem lies. It is in this lack of saying, in this country, we are a democracy with these basic values, and you, of course, must agree to this social contract if you want to be a citizen. We don't force you to be a citizen. And then to have a chance to work. And for instance, let me mention that we did an experiment in Norway because there is widespread discrimination of people with strange names, like my own, or sort of names that are not Norwegian when you apply for a job. So the Employers Association sent out applications with Norwegian names and identical applications with immigrant names. And there was a 30% difference in being called for interviews. So there's a clear discrimination if you're named Abdullah, you get nowhere.
I want to come back to this last question of terrorism, because I think that is a little more complicated. Because it's, the main question is, only the Christian religion have a clear distinction between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the earth. And it's not easy to find this distinction in the Muslims. The people of Muslims, very good people. We have fantastic people, etc., etc. But there are a problem with this religion, especially with this common martyrium, Christian martyrhood, I don't know, today, because they are a real attack. It's not only terrorism, it's an attack to the religion, to the Christian religion. It's a new form of martyrium. We have profanation of the Eucharisty. We have many churches. We have these kind of things. We need to know this problem. Really, I think, of course, when I asked this to the cardinal, you remember this, the cardinal said, we need many years that the people understand a new form of life, because of course they need to understand that it's impossible to kill all the other people. But I don't know if they know this today, because also in the text of the Quran we have both things. A real many texts that are in favor of peace and reconciliation, but there are other texts that are in favor of the war. So it's very complicated. I think it's not only terrorism, but it's a religious question. I ask to you that you have the same impression. Here in Italy, there are many newspapers to speak about this today, after the problem that we have in Easter.
I would like to just say that I expect after the Sri Lanka attacks and others, and the Sri Lanka attacks were clearly on Catholics and also some Protestants and on Westerners. So it's both hitting the religion and also the Westerner as such. And I think for them, for the terrorists, Christianity appears to be a sort of Western phenomenon, but of course it is a Middle East origin. But I expect Muslims that are shocked by this to say, this is not Islam. You destroy everything for us. Why don't they do that? This is a question. Why isn't there a massive Muslim reaction against Salafism and Wahhabism and so on?
Many countries pay for this. Many Islam countries pay and give money to these people. We know this, so we know for the police these things, so it's not clear.
It's not those who are not experts. So I think the Western states must say, in these countries, these are the rules: separation, religion, and politics, equality of the sexes, individual conscience, etc., etc. And of course, this is the natural law program. This is the whole Western tradition, which is Christian and not Christian. I mean, it's secular in the political sphere, but the view of the human being has been developed mostly by Christianity. And say, if you want to be here, you must accept these basic values. And if you can't do that, then that's not our problem. Instead, we try to say, what's Islam really about? And is it compatible with liberal democracy? We can never answer that question. It's not our job to answer that question.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful exposition. I have found a lot of common sense that has been expelled from the political discourse. One first question. Don't you think that we should introduce more of a pragmatic and quantitative point of view in this discussion? I mean, the problem is not migration yes, migration no. We know that migrations, when they are contained within certain numbers and when they are diluted in a reasonable period of time, are an element that strengthens a community. We know that when they are too much concentrated in a short period of time, they cause a xenophobic reaction. People feel threatened. If we want to have a reasonable policy, we must move from the discussion in principle, migration is good, migration is bad, to the question, how many people can we receive and integrate? By the way, Pope Francis, who usually is considered as an unqualified advocate of migrations, has said exactly this in one of his, I don't know where he was going, somewhere in the airplane. He said, yes, we must accept them, of course, within the limits in which we can. And as a politician, I must try to see what are the limits of the capacity of my people to accept. Yes, also, more than once. Should we not try better to understand how it works concretely, also in the quantitative dimension? The second observation regards the fact that I think that the globalization was good for the poor of the world, and good for the rich of the world, and bad for the middle classes and for the poor of the rich countries. Much of the populism arises out of this consideration. You, elite, feel more at ease with other elites of other countries than with us, your fellow countrymen. And you want to treat us, your fellow countrymen, in the same way in which you treat the poor of the world. But we have a right to an intensified solidarity. That is, to the others, you can give charity. We have a right to a social state. I think this is one fundamental element of our discussion. The third observation is that I am the happy husband of a psychoanalyst, and she tells me that a vast majority of the people today are not psychologically balanced. We have a lot of people that are fragile, and fragility means the incapacity to accept frustration, and they put in question, because of the way in which they have been formed, the principle of contradiction. Our civilization was based on the principle of contradiction. Now, the opposite principle arises, the principle of indistinction. Indistinction means that I do not accept to be measured by reality. I pretend my inner feelings to measure reality because I do not succeed in channeling my inner feelings towards an adequate approach to reality.
Yes, there's a lot. I won't take your time on this, but just I think the internet is a problem in this regard because people can sit alone and have their echo chambers. The algorithm sends you the same fake news that you want to see, and people are lonely because with the breakdown of the family, so few children in Europe, there is so little community left, little family, perhaps little local community. And as Aristotle pointed out, man is a rational and social animal. You need to be in a community. You can't be a citizen sitting there just alone. So there must be a re-education of citizenship, public service, community service. It's not about just instrumental interest. Thank you.